Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 14th of January 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the show tonight, and welcome to another live stream. We do this every Tuesday evening, and we have all sorts of guests on covering all sorts of different aspects of finance and politics and all those things. But one of the best guests that we have, one of the most popular ones is Robbie, and I'll bring Robbie in just a second. Just before I do that, let me remind you that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. It's a general conversation only. Please play nice in the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and questions and observations in. I won't necessarily follow all of what's going on there because there's just so much. But if you want to ask a specific question, if you use that walk the world, that'll get my attention. And that means that you can get your question in to either Robbie or myself. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to get your question to the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here, always greatly appreciated, and it really helps us to do what we need to do in the channel here. We don't do this for profit, we do this because we think there's a really important conversation to be had. Right, let me bring Robbie straight in. Hi, Robbie, how are you going? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Martin. Good to see you.
I think this year's going to be quite interesting, right? So we have an election coming up. But I think as we sort of start this conversation, and I'll let you introduce yourself a bit more formally in a second, we had some quite good wins in 2024, right? So the power of social media, the power of getting activations of people down on the ground to make our politicians sit up and take notice actually was quite successful. And I think that lays the foundation well for the start of this year.
Absolutely. We ended 2024 with a bang. Hang on, I got to say something, Martin, before we go on in this vein. I've been a bit distracted since I saw your setup there, which is quite an impressive setup. I realised I think you could actually be a Bond villain.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Got everything at your fingertips to control the whole world there. Or when I was a kid, I used to watch Inspector Gadget cartoons, and the Dr. Evil had a similar kind of setup. I think he's called Dr. Evil. Anyway, I'm sure you use your immense power for good, though. So that's why I'm happy to talk to you.
Well, we do try. Look, the fact of the matter is that this system grew over sort of about 10 years, right? So, I started off really small with just one camera and et cetera, et cetera. But when I rebuilt the studio a couple of years ago, I decided that I needed enough screens to be able to control everything without messing around all the time. So I ended up
control everything.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it is actually, everything here is in the cockpit, right? So I can move the cameras, I can control everything and switch everything. For those who are interested, I might do another show actually sometime just on the nature of how the studio works, because it's evolved quite a lot. But it's got to the point now where I think hopefully everything is at my fingertips until it goes wrong.
Well, you're irreplaceable. Anyway, back to 2024. Carl said Robbie needs a cat. No, I don't, Carl. I had a cat. Martin needs a cat to have on his lap.
Very good.
Back to 2024. Yeah, we ended the year with a bang. You and I spoke a couple of weeks before the end of the parliamentary year, and that last week of Parliament was quite extraordinary. And it started off with, in fact, we might have talked on the first. I think we talked on the second day of the last fortnight, if I remember right. And that's right. So it started off with what we already covered, which is the government itself moving to dump the mis- and disinformation bill, the MAD bill.
Yeah.
And that killed it off. And of course, that was already in the wake of the Trump election victory, which was a whitewash, and that put paid to that kind of thing in the United States, or it certainly strengthened the hands of the biggest critics of that. You've now seen, actually, as an aside on that, you would have seen what's his name? Mark Zuckerberg's big mea culpa. Complaint. He's now the victim, of course.
It's very interesting that he actually admitted that the fact checkers were as biased as everybody else, right? Which is exactly our point.
Well, that's the point. That was our point. There is no, like, you're a philosopher. Where is this thing called objective truth? I mean, so much is based on point of view. But anyway, they didn't want to accept that. Now the rug's been pulled out from under that. Seemingly, they're going to come back. The people who've been pushing this agenda are going to come back again. But the driver out of the United States seems to have been fully exposed at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see how that played out. Certainly here from a political standpoint, that was a massive victory for the people who value free speech and a massive defeat for the government. And then it was followed up by this extraordinary last week of Parliament where in the last day, 40 bills were rammed through in the Senate in one day. 40 bills. Now, one of our mutual friends, Senator Jared Rennick, who was there when it happened, told me that there were 120 votes in the final day. 120 votes. Now, every time they vote, if you watch Parliament, they have to ring the bells, and that ringing goes for a minimum of a minute, often 4 minutes, and then they've got to sit in there on the yes or no side, and then they've got to be counted. And so if there's 120 votes in a day, there's no time for scrutiny, no time for debate. They took time out to say goodbye to Simon Birmingham, the Liberal leader in the Senate who announced his retirement. But it just made a joke of the parliamentary process. You can only do that sort of thing, Martin, when all the deals have been stitched up behind the scenes. And this is something that our party, if the Citizens Party ever got into Parliament, we want to change. Parliamentary debates should mean something. You should have the opportunity to change your colleagues' minds by the power of your argument in Parliament. And that just doesn't happen. It's all about the wheeling and dealing that takes place. So anyway, that happened. And in the middle of that, one of the things they got through was this social media ban for under 16-year-olds. And what that sets up, and it'll be interesting to see how that collides with this setback to the internet censorship agenda, because what that sets up, the social media ban, is, because it has to be figured out how it's going to be done now, is whether we're going to have some form of identification process that we're all going to have to be exposed to be online, right? Not just the under 16-year-olds, of course. The whole digital, mandating some form of digital ID. So they ran that through. But I do have good news, because it wasn't, in the middle of all that, it wasn't all bad. And one bill that got through is one bill that actually, unlike a lot of the others, did receive intense scrutiny because it came from us. And that was the RBA reforms bill. And you and I talked about this quite a few times on the show. This was the bill where Jim Chalmers wanted to legislate to repeal the Treasurer's, his own power to overrule the decisions of the RBA. And from the very beginning, when this bill was put up, Senator Malcolm Roberts, I remember, gave a speech in Parliament and said, "What politician in history has ever proposed to give away his own power? I don't want this power. I don't want this power." He's Frodo going up into the whatever it's called, Mount Doom or something. Haven't watched the movie for a while. Going to throw away the ring. I don't want this power. I don't want this power. And because with great power, of course, Martin, comes great responsibility. And the whole point of this power was, it was legislated by Curtin and Chifley 72 years earlier, so that unelected bureaucrats didn't control the whole country. That the greatest power in the country, which is the money power, had to have ultimate democratic accountability. And Jim Chalmers was proposing to give that away and entrench the Reserve Bank as a financial dictatorship of unelected technocrats. And we led the opposition to that. Anyway, so thanks to us and the Greens, in this case, the Greens played a very important role. That was going nowhere. That bill was going nowhere. And what Chalmers was desperate to do was salvage his reputation on it. And so he said to the Greens, "What do you want?" They said, "Well, if you got to drop the repeal of Section 11, you got to keep that power. You got to keep Section 36 power, which is Section 36 is whereby the RBA can direct the private banks as to the kind of lending they can do." not specific loans they must make, but the kind of lending. And I think we've been advocating for a while that's a power that should be used. The RBA could have used that many times over the last period to rein in the investor lending that has driven up house prices in Australia and put a bias towards first home buyers and things like that. They could have done that, and they haven't done it because they've helped to create the housing bubble. So they were going to get rid of that as well, and the Greens said, keep that too, and you can have your bill. And Chalmers, just so he could say he got these RBA reforms bill through, he dropped the two most important parts of the bill, and he passed this thing that's just mainly just about the question of this second board, this governance board that they've set up. So we regard that as a significant victory for our campaign to stop him giving up that Section 11 power. And that power now still resides with the Parliament, and that's the most important thing. So that also happened on that very last day, and therefore that ended up being a significant victory for a fight that had occupied us for about 18 months in the middle of all the other stuff we were doing.
Yeah, and it was a complex year. Of course, we had the regional banking inquiry, which ran for quite a long period of time. And there were some very powerful recommendations at the end of that process. And the banks were really shown as, not working for Australia rather than against Australia. And I have to tell you that it's gone a bit quiet since the regional banking inquiry recommendations. I thought there was a sort of a normal window when things would begin to happen, but it seems it's gone very, very quiet.
Well, we had some indications that some stuff was being looked at. The first recommendation was that there should be a banking and cash guarantee. People should have guaranteed access to banking services and to cash. That was the first recommendation. The second recommendation was for an expert panel to look at a postal bank. And the third recommendation was to make, these are the big three, was to make the banking code of practice mandatory instead of voluntary. And initially, after those recommendations were made, we heard a little while after that a report in the Australian that a postal bank was back on the Labor government's agenda. We were very excited about that, but it's been almost radio silence on that since. I know of some discussions that have taken place in the with Treasury and the Finance Department, etc., that are people, putting forward proposals of how this sort of thing could work. But it's not good enough because there's a rule in Parliament that the government must respond to an inquiry report within 90 days. And well after the 90 days expired, the government still has not responded to that report. They have acknowledged the report. And what they've been doing is doing things piecemeal. So there's been some behind the scenes discussions about should we look at a postal bank. That's what the Australian newspaper indicated. And as good as that is, it shouldn't be done in a piecemeal fashion. There's been a discussion that the government has initiated about a banking levy whereby the banks that have the fewest branches, but relative to their deposits, have to subsidise the banks that have the most branches relative to their deposits to support the maintenance of bank branches in regional Australia. So Jim Chalmers had a private meeting with the biggest bankers in Australia about that, and he made them all sign a non-disclosure agreement first. And within that apparently, Martin, is a hallmark of dealing with this government, with the Albanese government. Everyone has to sign non-disclosure agreements. What is it with governments and not wanting transparency? Hey, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. They're so addicted to secrecy, these governments, and this is them dealing with the bankers in this way. So nobody knows what they're actually talking about, except the discussion has actually happened. And again, it's piecemeal, right? Because what we propose that we're fighting for is, implement a guarantee that's in the recommendations and start a postal bank, and you'll get what you need. The third thing, which we need to talk about more in depth, is that the government's doing piecemeal now is looking at this question of mandating the acceptance of cash, but only for big businesses and only businesses that sell essential goods and services. So the government is proposing a mandate. And on paper, that sounds good, but I've been consulting with some people who are warning that, hang on, this may not be what we think it is. Why does there have to be an exemption for small business, for instance? What does that say to make an exemption for small business, where the default position at the moment is that every small business knows that unless they put a sign on the door that says no cash, and very few small businesses really want to do that, but the banks are pressuring them to do it. Every small business knows they're probably going to cop a serve from the public if they have that sign up. If they are specifically exempted from a mandate, though, that only applies to Coles and Woolies and the service stations, in practice, then that strengthens the hand of the people who want to go cashless. That's one of the concerns that's been put to me, which could be a serious problem if that's how it plays out. I would think most small businesses would want to accept cash. But again, before we get into more of the details of that, I know you've got some of the graphs. Again, this is the government dealing with this stuff piecemeal instead of respond to the inquiry report and the recommendations. Tell us what your response to the recommendations is going to be. And the first recommendation is legislate a guaranteed access to banking services as an essential service and access to cash. If you designate these things as essential services, that puts a legal obligation on the banks and it puts a legal obligation on the government. And that is a much more elegant way to solve the problem. And it's right there in their recommendations. You're way overdue from responding to them. Why aren't you responding to them? Why are you doing this stuff piecemeal? I don't want to sound like a totally negative Nelly. I'm happy that we pushed the government to have to address these things. We have done that. The collective we who've taken up these issues have done that. And of course, our party had a very big role in the Senate inquiry into bank branch closures that produced these recommendations. So what's wrong with the government following the due process of Parliament and actually saying, okay, that's the recommendations from a group of eminent senators who took 15 months to look at this in depth, etc. All right, we'll look at those recommendations seriously and we'll give you our response. What's wrong with doing that? No, instead they're doing this piecemeal fashion, and that part of it is a worry.
And to me, it speaks to one simple thing, and that is that politicians are quite scared of the power of the financial players and their ability to lobby and also influence, below the waterline. Many of the people that I've spoken with in the parliamentary system that will admit they are really quite concerned because these people have way too much power. And therefore, whilst you might want to sort of push off in one direction, if you do it too overtly, you immediately get a massive amount of flack from the financial players. And of course, they have huge capacity to influence and make a fuss. I mean, we see it not only in the financial system in the sector, but we also saw it in the mining sector with the, with the resources rent tax previously. We've seen it in the big energy sector as well. I would say that we've seen it both in the airline industry and in the supermarket area as well. So almost always, the government seems to me to be quite timid when it comes to moving the dial. And, even when there are strong recommendations coming out from inquiries and people knowing that there are real issues, frankly, quite often they prefer to sort of, come back and, we'll do small things and we'll do little piecemeal things. And okay, there is this mandate for cash acceptances document, which is out there now. It's actually issued on the 19th of December. It's, just over a month left to go now. And the consultation paper considers the needs for those who rely on cash, the mandate, scope and application, how to promote compliance, cash distribution access. So those are all quite laudable things. Now, going back to your point about, is there a catch? Well, Dale Webster at the regional made the point, I should put this out very recently, does anyone realise that the proposal mandate to allow newsagents to refuse to take cash for a newspaper, it's tip of an iceberg. In other words, could it well be that we actually end up with the small players potentially not wanting to or not able to, not willing to? Now, interesting, in the UK, a report just came out said two things. One is use of cash is up quite consistently, and younger people are using cash more because they want to control their budgets more. But the other thing that came out in the UK research was that it's small businesses who are swinging back to cash fast now. Why? Because it's quite convenient relative to other forms of payment. And interestingly, they have to pay more to use digital services relative to payments through cash. So now they actually are giving discounts for cash relative to use of digital services. So it's very interesting that, when you stand back and look at this, I think a lot of small businesses are very willing and happy to receive cash, and in some cases are offering discounts. So maybe, we shouldn't overreact to the idea of small businesses not having to. Maybe they will want to. But, it is part of this bigger question. Why is it that we can't get bold policies on some of these things from government? Why is it that we seem to be pulling back and pulling back and pulling up and just doing little marginal things around the edge, which seem to take forever? By the way, I could also have the same for the payday lending sector as well, which has taken ages and ages to try and move the dial on that, and it's still not where it should be. It's almost as if government is frightened.
Government is frightened. Part of the problem, Martin, is these parties of government, as the two major parties in Australia like to call themselves, Labor and Liberals, the parties of government, and they look down their nose at all the other parties on the crossbench, which is now, collectively almost the same size as each of the two major parties, but they are the parties of government ordained, by the same divine right that the old kings of England had to be to share government. They're in bed with these corporate entities, and so that actually helps increase the tension when something overwhelming. There's an overwhelming prerogative to do something, because the public is crying out, "Do something," and they've got to turn around and Jim Chalmers rolls over in bed and says to Anna Bligh, "Sorry, love, you got to take one for the team." There could be a problem here, and Anna Bligh says, "No, I get paid by the banks not to let them take one. You got a war on your hands, and do you want us to run ads against you like the mining industry did that you referred to with that resource rent tax, which were very clever ads, by the way." But I maintain that the banks, in my view, Martin, the banks are still different to every other sector. The banks are universally hated, accepted as a necessary evil, but they're universally hated. And the evilness of a corporation is in inverse proportion to the touchy-feeliness of their ads on TV. So every time you see a new bank ad on TV, you get sucked into this lovely melodrama and something, and there's things on the TV that are tugging at your emotional heartstrings, and you're about to burst into tears in empathy with the people on the screen, and then suddenly it's an ad for Westpac, like because they're trying to desperately sell a brand that is universally reviled, right? So therefore, the government, if they actually had their head screwed on, would be saying, "Hang on, you can't, maybe the big mining companies were making lots of money for Australia and for their investors and whatever, and they weren't seen as quite so evil. But the banks have a terrible reputation. Someone has got to, do a Trump in that sense and just overthrow the chessboard and say, no, you guys, point them out. You guys, just like Trump does with the media, right? You're fake news. So you're the enemy of the people. You said that about the media. You're the enemy of the people. Someone in Australia's got to say the banks are the enemy of the people, and watch the Australian people rally behind them when they say that, because they'll recognise the truth that the banks aren't going to win this one if the political figures have the moral rectitude to actually go after them. What they try and do is be all things to all men, and that's the way that that has been the whole Albanese government approach for 3 years. They want to please everybody, and in turn they piss off everybody. They please nobody, and they piss off everybody. And so they've dealt the Liberals back into the game. There is a chance they could lose this election and the Liberals win government. So that's the problem with, and of course the Liberals are not going to be any better on the banks, and that's the other problem. The two major parties are both to Ben Chesterman, you shouldn't, because you can change the government, Ben Chesterman, but you can't change the banks. There's the problem with the banks. I deal with these people in government. They are scared of the banks. That's the reason you hate the government. They're scared of the banks. We got to break the power of these banks. They sit as this unelected dictatorship above the system, and they play off both sides constantly, and they've corrupted the whole process. That's been the legacy of neoliberalism. And what happens is people think, oh, I hate government. The private sector is so much better. No, this is a what do they call it? A crony capitalist utopia in this country, right? That they've set up because they've hobbled government from doing the things that government should do. And instead, government is doing everything to say, how do we serve this corporate sector? How do we serve this corporate sector? How do we serve that corporate sector? And it starts with the power of the banks. And that's what we have discovered from one end of this country to the other. Now, I wanted to mention something, Martin, because we're talking about the consultation paper and what Dale talked about, etc. Dale Webster. One of the things that's coming out of this process, because there was a footnote in this consultation paper that is quite revealing. It turns out, if you look at the way the government is actually discussing the need for a cash acceptance mandate, we've won a lot of our arguments. Now, so that, to put aside whether the way they've structured, they're proposing this cash acceptance mandate is any good, but they're acknowledging our arguments. I went to every hearing of the Senate inquiry into bank closures in regional Australia, and I was like screaming into a gale. Why is the government allowing Westpac to just pull the pin on the town of Coobapedy in Central Australia and just leave the town to its own devices? Absolute disruption, where everyone's got to scramble to buy safes to keep their cash in. They've got to travel 540 kilometres to the next bank. They've got to travel in convoys because 2 hours of the trip, there's absolutely no phone coverage even. And so there was a real concern in the town about the security of it'll get out after a while that people driving south could be carrying large amounts of cash on them to put in a bank, right? And it wasn't a branch where the business model for Westpac had ever changed. It was a unique branch because people flew in from all around the world to buy the opals at Coobapedy, and they paid in large amounts of cash, and they either got the cash out of the bank or the seller put the cash into the bank. That's always the role that bank branch had played. But because boffins in Westpac's headquarters in Sydney wanted to go cashless, right? They fingered that as one of the branches to close, and they didn't have the consequence. And I'm thinking, why did the government allow this? Why are they sitting on their hands and allowing this, and all the social problems that go on? And that included to the Aboriginal community up there, where Aboriginal people could go into the bank without even having a card, and because the bank knew them, get their money from the banker over the counter, and all that was taken away by this decision. Why did the government allow it? And if that's true for Coobapedy, it's true for the whole country. Why did the government actually allow it? Look at the massive problems here. Doesn't the government know that if we don't have cash, then when there's a natural disaster, and there always will be natural disasters, I mean, the bloody richest suburbs in the world are just burnt up, for crying out loud, in Hollywood, right? All these movie stars, like, if it can happen to them, and it can happen to anybody, literally. When there's a natural disaster, the only thing that works is cash. Why is the government allowing the banks to do this? And I felt like I was screaming into a gale with this issue. And in this consultation report, the government has actually made all the same arguments. They've now accepted the argument. We've got through to them that there are all these principled and practical reasons why cash is both desired and necessary. So that there is quite a significant victory for our work. And on this subject, of course, starting with Scott Morrison's $10,000 cash ban back in 2019. But the other thing that jumped out at me, Martin, was from the footnotes, is one of them was to an RBA report from 2023, where since December 2022, the media has trumpeted every time this question of cash has come up since December 2022. the media have said cash is dying, cash is on the way out, because the latest RBA survey published in December 2022 said that the use of cash was only used for 13% of transactions. It had plummeted to 13% of transactions. And that seems, really small. It turns out that's a survey the RBA does once every 3 years with 1,000 people. And those 1,000 people are given a $100 gift card, apparently, to keep a diary for a week on all their transactions. And then at the end of the week, hand over to the RBA what their transactions were. Now, there's a scientific principle that says you can't observe anything without changing it. And so if you're getting people to be self-conscious about all their transactions activity for a week, that self-consciousness alone is going to influence the way they spend their money. And whether you like it or not, it just is, especially if they're worried about how cash transactions might be perceived. So I don't know. I'm just casting a little bit of aspersions on it from that standpoint. I don't think it's an absolutely objective survey at all. And it turns out the RBA does an annual survey anyway that contradicts it. The RBA does an annual survey where they just call people up and they ask a simple question. The last transaction you made, how did you pay for it? And the answer to that question from 25% of people, not 13, 25% of people was cash. And that had been the same the year before and the same the year before that. So it's holding steady at 25% answered that survey question. Yeah, my last transactions I paid in cash. So that is not cash use plummeting. That's cash holding steady despite, I don't know if you happen to have those graphs. If people can look it up in the, this might be a different report, but despite the fact that since 2017, 30% of branches have closed. And since 2016, 25% of ATMs have been ripped out. A net loss of 8,000. So even though you've had private ATMs come and replace the bank ATMs, because more bank ATMs have been ripped out, and there's been private ATMs replace them, it's a net loss of 8,000. So despite having many, many thousand fewer bank branches to access cash and 8,000 fewer ATMs to access cash use is holding steady at, according to that RBA survey, at about 25% of Australians randomly surveyed say my last transaction was in cash, right? So that destroys the whole premise of that argument. And this is something that this is a great scam that the banks, aided and abetted by the RBA, have been running on the Australian people through these false newspaper headlines trumpeting the demise of cash.
Yeah, and just one other point, of course, when you look at the percentage of transactions, the other point is that the volume of transactions has rocketed. And the reason it's rocketed is because it's actually more convenient now with tap and go and those sorts of things. So in fact, total transaction volumes have risen. So when you actually start seeing the percentage of cash use coming down a little, it's still going up in absolute numbers.
Yeah, that's right.
So despite the fact we've got less branches and less ATMs, people are still using cash. And again, in the UK, the survey showed the reasons that people were using cash is, one is when they're under financial pressure, they feel more in control of their finances by using cash. Secondly, banking systems have tended to crash and burn, and that makes it quite hard sometimes to be able to use. And then, as you say, in the case of natural disasters, and we've had a fair share of those in Australia and other places around the world too, then the electronic systems no longer work. So cash is useful for that as well. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why cash is an important element. It's also a human right, and it's also, at the moment, it's legal tender. So therefore, by definition, it should be there, right? So for all those reasons, this cash stuff is a really important discussion. And whilst you're right, a lot of the media are still saying, oh, well, cash is going out of business, blah, blah, blah. When you actually look and see, well, who's saying it? Well, of course, the banks are saying it. Why are they saying it? Because there is a cost. There is a cost for the banks handling cash. CBA is about 500 million or something, right? I mean, it was quite a reasonable number. But That's the cost of them doing business, because
Yes.
they are in the business of money, and that includes cash. So if banks are going to say we're not interested in doing cash related things because it costs too much, then what they're doing is pushing all those costs out to other people. So once again, it's the banks who are actually running this agenda on an economic argument rather than a social justice argument or on a human rights justification, or indeed, in reality, people still want to use cash. So finally, the government's woken up. But again, it's been a long, slow grind here. And once again, it's like we have to drag them kicking and screaming into the real world.
One of the things the consultation paper points out is that there's actually a movement. There's movement around the world among many governments to say, okay, some form of cash acceptance mandate is necessary. And they cite a bunch of the European countries where, of course, some countries in Europe, like Sweden, went very far down the cashless path. And now the central banks of those countries are themselves mandated. No, we've got to go back because we just can't survive without this.
Yep.
I think it was probably 2023. You and I would have had a discussion just after the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, following a natural disaster, said, thank God we had cash. Cash was the only thing that made a difference, right? And there was a big consultation in New Zealand, which was swamped by the Kiwis. So the message has gotten through, and I was getting frustrated with our government. Just, hey, look at these other governments around the world, and look at the fact they've allowed this to go much farther than we have already. So learn from their mistake. Don't go that far. They're already moving back. We should move back before going down that far. And that is what, at least rhetorically, they're saying in this report, which is really good to see. It means that you can sometimes sound like a Johnny One Note on these subjects, but when it comes to politics, it's the way you got to get through to these clowns. You've got to mobilise the support, muster your arguments, educate people, and that's why right now is a good time just to mention we're talking about this consultation paper. We need everyone who's watching make a submission to the consultation. We'll put up a if you can just Google it, mandating cash acceptance consultation, and you'll find the details there. We're going to put out a release tomorrow on the Citizens Party's website, and people can get the details there. Submissions close on Valentine's Day, 14th of February, so there's about 5 weeks. Make a submission. And one of the part 4 of the consultation paper says, okay, if you have a mandate, how do you support it? And what we'll be telling our supporters, as we've been telling them to do for quite a few years now, is there's an obvious one that is required, which is people got to have access to cash. The consultation paper admits it. The Treasury admits it. People got to have access to it. Well, the one way the government can guarantee access to cash, regardless of what the private banks do, start their own bank again. A public post office bank where every post office is a branch, and you'll have the biggest retail bank in Australia overnight, and everybody can always have access to cash, not little piddling amounts like you currently get through Bank at Post, proper access to cash. It'll also transform the cash distribution network in Australia if Australia Post is back involved in cash distribution. If you want an example, Martin, of what the difference Australia Post used to make when it was involved in cash distribution, this was in a 1999 report on bank closures back then called Money Matters in the Bush, I think, or Money Too Far Away. It was one of those. And they just noted that up until the mid-90s, certainly in Western Australia, Australia Post was involved in distributing cash. And then there was an excuse made for Australia Post to get out of it so that these private, Armaguard and whatever, type companies, cash and transit companies could take all of it. And then I think one of the excuses was security reasons. But the difference was for your average bank branch, when Australia Post was involved in distributing cash, it was the cost to the bank branch was $20 a week. When Australia Post got out of it, that cost to the bank branch went up to $600 a week. And that was back in the mid-90s. Went from $20 to $600. That's huge. And the bank branch closures inquiry heard repeatedly from smaller banks in all of the regions that the actual cost of moving cash was in their top 3 branch costs. Just the cost of moving cash was consistently in their top 3 branch costs. So if you get if we have a postal bank, where Australia Post once again gets to use its infrastructure as well to help move cash, you can actually solve that problem, I believe, as well. Make that process much more efficient and cheaper for the people of Australia and for the network to actually work. So if our argument is, okay, government, if you're going to require businesses to take cash, it's your responsibility to make sure they have it ready access to source it and bank it. And the best way you can do that is don't go sucking up to the private banks and say, please keep your branches open. You force them to compete with you again, because it worked brilliantly last time and it'll work brilliantly again.
Yeah, and one other factor, of course, is there's always the question of deposit bail-in. And in other words, if you've got your deposits in a private financial institution and they get into difficulty, in theory, they could convert that deposit into equity in the bank, which isn't necessarily good. But if you actually put deposits with Aussie Post, which is a government-backed entity, then basically you've got government security on your deposits. And I suspect there will be quite a big flood of money towards Australian Post Bank, or whatever you wanted to call it, if it was established, because it's safe and secure and easy to access, more branches than any other type of entity. Of course, the problem we have at the moment is that Australia Post is being run by people who only consider it to be a parcels business and are actually thinking of closing Australia Post outlets, when in fact they should see it as a huge asset, and that asset, to the benefit of all Australians, could be very powerful if it was actually harnessed appropriately.
And that's what you just said is the real worry, because the clock is actually ticking on this proposal, because the current management of Australia Post is gunning to gut it. It's being run by ex-Woolworths, Subway and McDonald's executives who, and this blows my mind. I mean, they don't have so the Woolworths guy who's the CEO, Paul Graham, so he's a logistics guy. He knows how to move trucks around. Good on him. So he has at least that experience. But aside from that part of his experience, he didn't run Woolworths. He was just one of their executives. Now he's running Australia Post. Aside from that experience, he's the people under him that deal with the post office network have no experience in the post office as a business. It's like I said, they're former McDonald's and Subway executives, and 2/3 of the network are run by these small businesses. They're called licensed post offices, and we have a mutual friend, Angela Cramp, who's the leader of the licensed post office group from your old hometown of Wollongong there. And they are screaming from the rooftops that if something is not done about the way Australia Post is being managed in the wake of Scott Morrison bullying Christine Holgate out of her job as CEO, whom Angela Cramp and the licensed post office group described as the greatest CEO Australia Post ever had, they're saying now with this management, if something is not done, the postal network will collapse. They've already announced that they're going to reduce it by hundreds of post offices down to 4,000, which is the mandated level they're required to have. And at the moment, they've got over 4,250. So Australia Post has already said there's 250 communities, and most of these will be probably outer suburbs of the major cities that are going to lose their post offices. And so that's already on the cards. And then they don't have to close down the others. They'll end up achieving their closures by just allowing them to wither on the vine and go bankrupt. And the postal operators will close the post offices themselves. That's what's on the cards here. And we'll go from this beautiful network where we have a map we like to use, which one of the best features of this map of all the post offices in Australia is this sprinkling of freckles up the middle of Australia that no other private business matches. They're all post offices there. And they, no business that's purely run for profit would do what Australia Post does. But the Australia Post footprint has the best distribution in the country. And it's a service that serves all the people of Australia. And we could lose all of that if something's not done. And the government's sitting on its hands again, trying to say, oh, no, Australia Post is supposed to be run as an independent corporation, etc. And by the time something goes disastrously, then there'll be all sorts of shucks, nobody could have seen this coming, etc. Whereas that's a lie. They're being warned about it, and there's a beautiful solution on the table. If you want a system where Australia Post is a government corporation that's supposed to run at a profit, which it has been since 1989. Before that, it was just a branch. It was just a division of the Postmaster General's Department, right? That's what Australia Post for a century was. But they come up with this idea, this model of it's going to be a corporation that's got to run at a profit. Well, if you're determined to keep that, let it become a bank, because the banking revenue will save that whole network of post offices. They will not be unviable anymore. It's far better for Australia Post to be a bank than to be a parcels company. There's lots of parcels companies out there, and let it still be a parcels company. But right now, all they want to do, all these people running Australia Post want to do, is set records as a parcels company and not actually do the main job of delivering the mail, the basic job, or have the vision to say, okay, we could, because the guy, by the way, the guy who's running Australia Post now, he could start a bank tomorrow if he wanted to. It's in the postal legislation now. There's nothing stopping him from doing that if he wanted to do it, if he had the vision to do it. But they're so small-minded, and so this is why the government's got to step in, and the survival of the postal network's at stake. And so that's, if people weren't aware of that before, take that seriously. Imagine if we saw replicated in post offices the number of bank branches and closures in Australia, and just see the cannibalisation of this country by the continual closure of our services and the knock-on effect that will have, and realize, okay, no, something's got to be done about it. And that's why people need to get behind this campaign for a postal bank.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to be clearly a critical agenda point for 2025. I guess another one, Robbie, which we should move on to now, is the whole question of housing. And my belief is that the housing question will be a big political debate leading up to and through the election. We've got some indications from both sides now of the major parties in terms of what they're thinking, which is not much at all, really. The 1.2 million homes is an aspirational target that's going to be very hard to deliver. We've still got migration pumping out a lot of people. Dutton over the weekend said he wanted to reduce migration but increase the number of people in the construction sector to try and help. But we are in a situation where this is a real problem. There was an article over the weekend talking about the Great Australian Dream, now a nightmare, and highlighting the fact that a single Sydney-sider would now need an income of $234,960 just to afford a loan for the average Sydney home. In Melbourne, a bit easier, but not a lot easier. And basically, they're saying that this is really becoming a bit of a nightmare for single-income households. And the cost of living, of course, is a real issue. And interestingly, one of the observations was that now some people are now saying, "Well, I'm never going to own a property." So I made a show called "The Great Australian House Nightmare," and I highlighted it through my stress analysis, which, by the way, I'm going to be discussing in more detail next week on the show here and going into the postcode detail. But, we've gone off the rails here with housing, and it's a massive, massive issue. Now, you mentioned earlier on that the RBA, in theory, has the power to direct banks to lend in particular parts of the market, which is something to bear in mind. But the whole housing thing is really, really a major problem. And of course, we had the old Claire O'Neill story. I don't know whether you saw this, but Claire O'Neill was on Triple Hack, and basically what she said was that they really had no interest at all in seeing house prices fall. And I'll tell you a little story about that. I actually made a show about this and made another post quite recently. And Claire O'Neill's press team reached for me and said, "You're misrepresenting what she said." And I said, Oh, really? So a little YouTube channel who made the point that maybe house prices where they are unsustainable and maybe they will fall, got a direct approach from her office saying, oh, so they are really sensitive about this issue. So that's got a little insight as well.
Don't be coy. You are the great Martin North. You are the data scientist consulted by 60 Minutes in times past. Your name has weight, sir.
Not a lot, but anyway, I still preach the gospel. Look, we are in an unsustainable situation with regard to housing. House prices relative to incomes are completely distorted. They've been distorted because of bad lending policy and the banks pumping more and more money into the system, bad government policy because of what they've done. You can list a whole range of situations, but I believe that housing will be a critical election issue. I'm just not sure that either major party has much in the way of solutions to it.
No, they don't. And this was born out. There was an article that Shane Wright wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, just I think 1st or 2nd of January, where I think this was, I think he was reporting on the cabinet papers. So that every 1st of January, the cabinet papers from 20 years ago are released, and the cabinet papers showed that the government of the day in 2004 was advised by the Treasury to correct a mistake they'd made 4 years earlier or 5 years earlier, because 5 years before that, Peter Costello had famously introduced a 50% discount on the capital gains tax. And that discount combined, that was in 1999, combined with, this is my view, combined with a change the RBA made in 1998, where they got the Bureau of Statistics to remove the value of land from the calculation of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and inflation. So that happened in 98. Peter Costello introduced the capital gains tax in 1990, discount in 1999. And then in 2001, to win that election, John Howard introduced the original first home buyers grant of, I believe it was $7,000. Doesn't seem like much now, but at the time it was actually not insignificant, because house prices were nowhere near like they are now. And the combination of those three drove this flood of money into the market. So, well, the combination of the last two. So suddenly there was all these extra first home buyers assisted by the government, but all these investors came in thanks to the capital gains tax discount, and the banks were seeking them out. Suddenly this was a greater investment opportunity. And so the demand for housing went beyond the need for housing. They artificially created that. They created extra demand that went way beyond the actual need for housing. And so what happened? The house prices went up. And as the house prices went up, thanks to what the RBA had done, it wasn't showing up in the CPI. And therefore, instead of the RBA raising interest rates to dampen this, the RBA was able to keep dropping interest rates, which is what they did in the wake of the dot-com bubble burst. Every time one of these bubbles burst, and in 2000 it was the dot-com bubble, in the wake of that, drop interest rates, etc., until just before John Howard lost office, when interest rates started going up significantly, which is one of the reasons he lost office, and there was a cost of living crisis. People may not remember this, but Kevin Rudd got elected on the back of a cost of living crisis, and that was on the back of these interest rate rises. But that in a sense is the proof that this was a bubble created by government policy. And in 2004, the Treasury advised the Treasurer, Peter Costello, and the Prime Minister that your capital gains tax discount has created a problem. We have had an enormous explosion in house prices in this country, which is not sustainable and has made housing unaffordable. You need to fix it. And those cowards who had an opportunity to fix it 4 years after the event, or 5 years after the event, chose not to do it. They said, oh, we'll let the states deal with it. And now it's 24 years after the event, and it's a much, much, much bigger problem to fix. And that's one of that right there is a symbol of how Australia operates, Martin, which you've experienced more than me. I mean we've always said kicking the can down the road. That was the original kick,
Yep.
right, in 2004, and now it's an utter mess. And so then Claire O'Neill, and I think, look, some people, there's of the people watching this now, some people might freak out at what I'm going to say and what that young man said to Claire O'Neill on Triple J Hack, because she said house prices have to go up in a sustainable way, and he said, "Wait, don't they have to come down? We young people will never be able to afford a house unless they come down." And I don't know, they've got to go up. And there was enormous reaction to her among young people. This is the stuff revolutions are made of. If the baby boomer set in Australia cannot look themselves in the mirror and realize that whatever I think I'm worth, my own next generations are priced out of this most important of assets, the thing that puts a roof out of your head. And so it can't be worth you feeling like a millionaire to make your grandkids homeless. And then if you stop and think about it, it's all relative. You may think you're sitting on a $2 million asset. Well, how are you going to realize that asset? Sell the damn thing, unless you want to go move to one of those little tiny Tasmanian towns where no one lives anymore and you can pick up a place for, 150 grand now or whatever and live there. You're going to spend $2 million buying a new one. It's a completely relative amount of money. The issue is not, people should not fight the idea that house prices have to come down. I'm now a house owner, and I think they've got to come down. We can't fight that. We've got to look it in the face and go, okay, there's a problem here. How do we actually address that problem in a way that doesn't destroy the country? And there is a way. And this is something I've talked about on your channel in the past. And I'm consulting with people very, very widely on it. First of all, the government has to stop the process of driving house prices up. And that's where this Section 36 power of the RBA is very important. So the government, we made sure the government kept its power of the RBA and the RBA kept its power of the banks. So the government should say to the RBA, okay, this is what you're going to do. And the RBA should say to the banks, this is what you're going to do. The first thing you're going to do is stop lending money to bloody investors. Stop these investors that are just building up these massive portfolios and pricing everybody else. Stop it. It's far more important that people get to afford housing. But stop all the things that actually keep propping up the prices. If you take away the props, you don't have to. I mean, this, it's even scary to say it, I know, but if you take away the props, let the thing crash and let the dust settle, and let the chips fall where they may. But there are powers the government has and the RBA has to make sure this is an orderly process. If it happens, suddenly we go through a 2008 style crisis where this time in Australia, our house prices do crash. People are desperately going to want our policy. What's going to freak them out is the idea that we should try and engineer it and make it happen, because we're at this social catastrophe level in our society because of what we've allowed to happen here. Right. And what the RBA has the power to do is step in, and if the government puts on a mandate that a moratorium, that nobody loses their principal place of residence. So you can have a moratorium on foreclosures and keep everyone in their homes in the event of a crash. Everyone gets to stay in their homes. Don't allow the well-heeled people to come and just buy up stacks of real estate so you can go back to a Victorian style slumlord culture, or don't allow a repeat of what happened in America in 2008, where the same banks who got bailed out by the taxpayer turned around and evicted 12 million of those taxpayers from their homes because the government allowed them to do that. It was one of the greatest social crimes ever. It's the sort of thing that led up to the kind of tumultuous politics that we've got in America now, right? This saint Obama came in the middle of the global financial crisis, right, criticizing Goldman Sachs all the way through his election campaign, and then turned around and gave Goldman Sachs the keys of the kingdom to run the financial system under him as president. The whole thing, talk about the system being rigged. Talk about, who's the comedian that's it's a big club and you're not in it, right? People, it just proved how rigged the game was on behalf of the banks. Can't let that happen, right? And there's powers that were actually passed in all Australian states in the Depression, where moratoriums were put in place to keep people in their homes. And also in the Depression in America, Franklin Roosevelt legislated the Homeowners Reorganization Act, where they actually helped the banks adjust to the new values of these homes to stop them being a massive wave of foreclosures, or stop the wave of foreclosures across America. And the RBA can do that. Give the banks incentives to write down the values of this debt, so the debt that is left on these properties is actually affordable as well. Because that's the big problem. How do you get rid of the debt? My debate with John Adams is, John Adams says, pull the pin and let there just be a depression. And I think only someone who hasn't been through a depression can call for a depression. And in fact, just as a little bit of evidence of that, the Labor government of John Curtin and Ben Chifley in 1944 wrote a white paper on full employment. It's a famous white paper in Australian history. It's called a white paper on full employment. And that white paper makes the point that talks about the problem of inflation, and sort of like the level of inflation we have now. And it didn't advocate inflation, but it addressed this question of the debate between inflation and people advocating austerity to deal with inflation. And the paper says, because this is in 1944, just a bit over a decade after the Depression, and the paper said everyone who went through the Depression will always prefer a little bit of inflation over the brutal austerity of the Depression, where you can't even eat. Right. And that's what we have to, that in my view is what we have to guard against. And I'm just saying there's a way you can achieve the write down of the debt, which is the core evil in the system, this completely unpayable debt. And that's the bubble that the banks are trying to prop up by keep pushing the house prices up. You can achieve write downs where the banks have to be put through a form of receivership funded by the RBA to make sure that there's not just a wave of bank closures as well. But there's a way it can be done. And I'm in consultation with people who've thought through all the different mechanisms of how this could be done. Because if we don't do something like that, this house crisis, it's probably at breaking point now. If it's not at breaking point now, it'll be at breaking point very soon. One of the things that I just saw the other day is, or the other week, sorry, is there was by some measure somewhere between a prediction that 400 and 500,000 households in Australia may not be able to hang on until February if the RBA didn't lower interest rates. That's already enormous, a huge problem. And then just as I've been waiting to see how that's playing out, you go and put up your show, The Great Australian Nightmare, and you're naming all these suburbs in Sydney and Melbourne and whatever that I know, including 3064, which is literally behind my back, people. Behind my back is my house butts onto the Western Ring Road. Behind my back, behind that is that suburb. And there is 9,000 people severely mortgage stressed and rental stressed, 9,000 households in that area, and are on the verge of going under. And that's just one part of Melbourne. And that's not the worst part of Melbourne. There's Tarneet and Hoppers Crossing, and there's down in Cranbourne and those places that you name. And they're the Melbourne ones that I recognise. A bunch in Sydney, I recognise Liverpool, etc. And this is an enormous, enormous problem. And you're going to be manipulated election time by politicians who are going to come along like carpetbaggers and butter you up with these ideas that you can have it both ways. You can have your multi-million-dollar house values that make you feel financially secure, which is just a fictitious relative thing, and we'll do something. We'll pay lip service to do something for housing affordability for those poor young people. No, we won't. The young people are stuffed, and if we don't do something much bigger, and then in a society where your young people are stuffed, this is what revolutions are made of. That's a warning.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there was a super chat earlier on talking about the risk of social unrest and, will there be heavy-handed government intervention to try and stop that? We are
there will be
at a tipping point with some of these issues. And I do think that the housing issue is probably one of the most significant. And it's not being understood by those in government circles, maybe that want to understand, that some of these postcodes that we talk about, there are lots and lots of people now really up against it. Now, they're not going to fall over immediately, but that's why the spending is a little way down from where it normally is, because people don't have the capacity to spend in these particular areas. And yet what we're seeing now is we're seeing Dutton, for example, suggesting that you can raise your superannuation to be able to get a $50,000 extra kick, which will just put prices up even more. And that's the point. All of these first-time buyer schemes that come through just lift prices further. And I know the cost of construction is very high, and so if you do a bottom-up calculation of what it's going to cost to build, that's another factor in all of this. But unless we actually break this circuit in some way, then we're going to see social unrest. We're going to see more people living in tents and cars, or living with parents for longer, or sharing houses and those sorts of things. None of that's necessarily good socially speaking. It's interesting that Spain just announced that they're going to actually block foreigners from buying homes, or at least they're going to put a property tax on it. And, there are things that can be done.
Keep the Brits out.
Exactly right. Well, it's probably a good thing. But the point is, there is no joined up thinking on housing policy at the moment. And both sides of politics, as they come into the next election, are going to offer these little these little chips that we'll help a few more first-time buyers get in, or we'll give you access to your superannuation. None of this is solving it. Interestingly, talking about the debt problem, Steve Keen, the last election, when he was actually standing as a member, made very good policy on this. There are ways to deal with the debt side of it. But as you say, it requires restructuring of the banks, and it requires them to actually get back to their knitting rather than the stuff they are currently doing. But without it, there is no reason why house prices wouldn't continue to rise even more. And that's just a bit more pressure for those trying to get in. But of course, the problem is you've got a lot of people sitting on property, and as you say, paper profits. And at the moment, you're stuck. So this is why this is, for me, one of the most critical questions in the current debate. And, for me, it's a 2025 issue. It's going to be probably one of the biggest issues. And by the way, just on that, this is a little snippet, which is quite interesting, that actually Victorian households have fallen behind Tasmania in terms of household income now. So you can also see how state policy also intersects with some of the other stuff. And that's one of the reasons why we've got high levels of stress in the Victorian area, because income isn't growing because of bad policy more generally. So all of these things come under roost. I want to make one final point on this. I started my surveys in 2001, at the time when some of these policies were just coming in. And I was warning at that time of the risks that were building for housing in Australia. Now, it's taken a long, long time for that fuse to burn. Why has it taken so long? Because every time we get close to a problem, they throw more money at it. They throw more money at first-time buyers. They reduce lending standards. They do everything they possibly can to keep the can in the air for a bit longer. But at some point, it's going to hit the ground. And I'm of the concern now that this could actually be the year where some of these things really come home to roost. I think it's going to be quite tough for the RBA to cut rates. I think that with the exchange rate where it is at the moment, it's going to be significant pressures on them. But the point is, the RBA has more than one tool, but they just choose not to use it. And for me, that's an absolute disgrace.
It is. Michelle Bullock has lied her head off for 2 years. We've only got one tool. We've only got one tool. The media are complicit in this lie. Everyone says, "Oh, the RBA only has one tool." No, I've mentioned repeatedly tonight what their other tool is. It's Section 36 of the Banking Act that says they can call up the banks and say, "Stop lending bloody money in this area. Just stop it. We're ordering you. Stop. You shall not do it anymore." That's an order. Take the order or go to goddamn jail. Where it's in the law. You have to obey what we say. they can stop the banks doing it. That's their tool. She's a liar. They don't want to use that tool because we have a laissez-faire neoliberal economy where the market's going to work this stuff out. And as you've been saying since 2006, they don't do it. And every time the market pressures, the true market pressures come to bear, which are always come to bear to blow the thing out, they prop it up. Right, so the free market policies only work insofar as they can help the big corporates keep their control. Privatize profits, socialize losses, kind of thing. And this is the nub of the problem. They need to address this. But I come back to the viewer tonight and all your friends. If the Citizens Party is going to be talking about this a lot in the election, and we've fought very hard to increase our prominence through all the hard work we do, and we're very well known in Parliament. We've got to be much better known outside of Parliament if we ever hope to win anything. But we're going to work very hard. We're going to lead a fight on this question of housing, and some of what we say, the Greens are not wrong on everything they say. Max Chandler Mather is a blowtorch on some of this stuff in terms of actually identifying these his insistence that he doesn't accept the age-old lie that it's all planning policy that's the reason there's not it's all planning policy, etc. No, he identifies what I identified at the beginning, which is this was a deliberate policy creation of government policy, including this 50% capital gains tax discount, etc. They created this as a deliberate policy, but we've thought through much more than they have about all the ways to do this. So one of the things that has to be done is a much more public housing. The government has to go back to taking responsibility for a lot more public housing. When I say a lot more, I mean a bloody lot more. We built 100,000 public houses in 5 years after World War II, and all Albo can talk about is 30,000 in 10 years, and that's if his little scheme is capable of funding the damn thing. In WA, where, as you know, Martin, because of the house price, there has been price falls in Melbourne and a bit in Sydney, etc. The investors have been running to fresh markets like WA to push house prices up there. And so there's a massive jumps in house prices in Western Australia, and that's been incredibly disruptive and an impact on people over there. So Albanese has just been over in WA, and what did he announce? He announced 1,000 more houses. 1,000 more houses. That doesn't cut it. In 1920, the Victorian State Bank the bank itself built 5,000 public houses in 1 year. 5,000 in 1 year. If you extrapolate that out to today's population and Australia-wide, that's something like 75,000 houses in 1 year as purely public housing that Victoria alone was able to build back in 1920. We couldn't hope to do anything like that today unless we actually got our act together and said, okay, no, we're going to mobilize to do this. We have to make this happen. We've got to define the supply chain from the very beginning to the very end. Why are all the inputs so expensive, etc.? Let's address all those kind of problems as well. We may have to do some other things to, address some other policies. Like Victoria has half of this state lockdown and all this green stuff, these green restrictions on timber and whatnot. And that doesn't help, you don't have to loosen those restrictions permanently. But we've got a problem here to address, and then you have the problem, which I want to mention it in a certain way because I'm not trying to advocate for it. But the question of immigration is an issue, but it's an issue that itself is a government creation, and it's not the problem, the fault at all of the immigrants. And this is where I'm also worried, because when we say that we're at a tipping point, I've had a lot of direct feedback to me over the latter period, singling out immigration from one particular country, India, as something that's pissing people off. Now, Scott, hear me out here for a second. When you have this charade that the that the two major parties and the Reserve Bank get into, that revolves around this issue of Reserve Bank independence. And so the Reserve Bank raises interest rates and crushes everybody. And of course, that's not good for the government politically. And the main thing the government's scared about is what that might do to house prices. And so what is the government in control of? They're in control of the borders. And as the interest rates have been going up, they've opened the floodgates and let in many, many more people to increase the demand, the domestic demand in Australia, to keep that upward pressure on housing. And those people have come from one country in particular because Scott Morrison went and did a deal with that country to do that. Now, good on those people for looking for a better life, but that's your government. Don't ever get angry at your Uber driver or the person down the street, or if you're saying, oh, there's so many Indians around. Or as a funny aside, you've got to comment on this. We broke a bloody record in the cricket on Boxing Day because the all-time viewer recordship of a test, a boring old 5-day test match. Why? Because so many Indians live in Melbourne now, right? And it broke all the records, and it was a spectacular thing to see. But that actually reflects how big the population growth from one country has been in India. And this was a government thing. And so there's a lot more pressure on the Melbourne housing market, et cetera, as a result of that. And that's what the government created. And I really have to say, people can get, I'm not talking to your audience because I haven't had this feedback from your audience, but I've had the feedback from people that know how to contact me on social media. And so I just want to make a general statement in case any of them are looking. Don't come at me complaining about Indians. It's the biggest trap in the world. You're the biggest mug in the world if you think the problem is the person who's living in the house next to you, that somehow it's their fault. No, that is not. If you can't see past that, take your blinkers off. It's the government's fault. This is government policy that has created this. Now the issue is here. We have to address it, and one of the ways is we've got to massively expand public housing. But then we actually have to look at these other things and say, okay, if there's a way that we can have an orderly reorganization of both the banks and the housing market here to get these prices down and make them truly affordable, then we can lance this boil. And I had a family member in Florida in 2008 when the housing market crashed there, and I was really taken by his description after he came back to Australia, because he said, look, when the crash happened, it was traumatic. But when the dust settled, this is the way he put it, when the dust settled, housing was affordable again. Now, it's less affordable now, of course. They're starting to have the same problems again in America, but nothing like us. And we need to go back and get housing affordable again. That actually has to be done. And so when a party like us leads a debate on this, and the two major parties are going to try and sell you on, oh, no, you can keep your house values, don't believe them. They're lying to you because they're the ones that created this problem in the first place. Do not fall for that because you get freaked out at the idea that there may be an adjustment coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And, these paper profits that people are actually seeing are that. Until you actually come to sell, you actually don't know quite where you are. Now, Jason, thank you for the super chat, Jason. Do you see any future with the perfect storm, potentially insurance becoming affordable for those who are in stress? Yes, indeed. I was already seeing that. They actually can't afford to pay insurance. Could we see en masse people in stress being uninsured and their assets wiped out? There are huge risks now. And certainly in my surveys, there are more people who have stopped insuring their properties, even in prone areas. And in fact, prone areas, flooding areas, and also bush areas are where people are actually finding the insurance prices have gone through the roof, 20, 30, 40% higher, and they can't afford it. So they're actually exposed that way. Others are exposed simply because of the fact that the debt that they owe resides, even if, the property disappears for any reason, doesn't extinguish the debt. And that's something that people should bear in mind if you're not insured. So, yeah, you're touching on a very important issue here, Jason. I would say this is a subset of a broader question, which is the social pressures that we're seeing. And Robbie, coming back to your point, I too am very concerned that people are actually blaming some of those people on the ground for stuff which is actually bad government policy over a generation, and they just completely compound it. And here's another one, which is, I just want to touch on briefly. Energy is another example where bad government policy has made a stupid result where most of the export of gas is exported. We are actually spending 7.3% or thereabouts, actually, in the terminals to convert gas into LNG. And in the meantime, the ACCC warns that prices are going to go higher, and we've got to actually import into Victoria and New South Wales. This is another example of massive government failure of policy over a generation or two. And once again, neither side of politics want to actually have the real conversation we need to have about this.
No, they're on the take. I mean, this is, it's not even a policy failure. This is outright corruption, what was done here with the gas issue. Outright corruption. Outside of the global banking cartel and the Australian banking cartel, I mean, the global energy cartel, the big, the Seven Sisters oil cartel and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that has been where the real power has been held for so long. And we used to have a form of we at least had an aspiration to be independent from that as a country. And I might have mentioned some of this last time when Gough Whitlam legislated the Petroleum and Minerals Authority for Australia, which was to develop our own oil and gas resources. And then, of course, he was sacked by the Queen for his troubles. And it actually had something to do with that. Buy Back the Farm was freaking out. I mean, here's the story. He and Rex Connor had developed this whole plan to take sovereign control of our resources because they're all being controlled overseas. And they needed the $4 billion. They wanted to borrow $4 billion. I mean, that's how much how bad inflation's been. That's what the big scandal was in 1974. Him trying to borrow $4 billion. But he'd gone to the usual creditors in Wall Street and London, Morgan Grenfell, and Morgan Stanley. They were the lenders to Australia traditionally, and they refused to lend. And the whole of Wall Street refused to lend, and the whole of London refused to lend. They went on a creditor strike against Australia, and that's what. And Whitlam wasn't going to back down on this. Rex Connor got up in Parliament in the middle of 1974 when they had the famous joint sitting of Parliament after the double dissolution, and there was an anniversary of it last year. And he got up in Parliament, railed against us. He said, "We're trying to borrow $4 billion against $7.5 trillion of identified resource reserves. This is the safest loan in the history of the world," he said, "and you bastards won't lend it." And so that's when they got, unfortunately, and there's probably an element where they were set up to end up with this loan scandal that ended up bringing down the government. But he was still trying to re-legislate the Petroleum Minerals Authority just before he was sacked. And then John Howard was the next one to pull a Swiftie, because Australia was self-sufficient in petrol, in oil at the time, actual oil for our cars and etc. We were an oil exporter, and the oil market in Australia was based on a domestic market, based on the supply and demand domestically. So the oil was coming out of places like Bass Strait, where the Esso gas field was, the oil field was. Esso being ExxonMobil now, right? And so that was coming out of there, and the price Australians were paying for petrol was reflecting of the supply and demand inside Australia. And John Howard, as the Treasurer, conned Australians and said, "Oh, we need to price our domestic oil and petrol at the world price. It has to be a world parity price, because only then will the market be able to determine the efficient allocation of resources." That's actually what he said. And so, because both sides of politics accepted this, we just increased our price so that ExxonMobil, or Esso at the time, could make the world price out of Australia and gouge us even more. I mean, so there's not what we do with this gas stuff. You've got to understand this is not new. We have always had these two major parties since Whitlam have always bowed the knee to the resources cartel. Always. And the thing with the gas is it's now to me, it's at the Irish famine levels. And the Irish famine, I use that example because what most people who've ever heard of the Irish famine, it was when from 1845 to 1849, 4 million, Ireland went from a population of 8 million to 4 million, and its population today is still not recovered to this day. 2 million people starved to death. 2 million emigrated to America and Australia and all around the world to get away from it all. And the poor Irish people were living off the potato, and the potato blight destroyed the crop, and it destroyed them. But that whole time, Ireland was exporting copious amounts of food to England from estates owned by absentee English landlords. And the English army, the British army, was in Ireland protecting the export of that food from the starving Irish people so they couldn't touch it. And that was it's an extreme metaphor, but that's exactly what we've done to ourselves with gas. We have allowed this gas cartel to export, to come up with these big contracts to export so much gas to places like Japan, who buy it cheaper than I pay for gas in Melbourne, in Australia, and we don't have enough gas. They know the times of the year where we're just going to run out of gas on the East Coast. The West Coast doesn't have this because they have a gas reservation scheme, and the East Coast should have had a gas reservation scheme years ago where the government just says, common sense, the domestic market has to be served first and you export the surplus, and there's lots of surplus because we're got lots of gas. Oh, but no, the gas cartel says, no, we don't want to do that. Right. And so that both sides of politics just roll over and say, tickle my tummy. And that's what's happening. And, more and more people are finding out about this. And there's this great Twitter channel a lot of people might be familiar with now, Punters Politics, where this young punter, he likes taking these issues and explaining it to people. And it's becoming more well known. But stop seeing it as a policy stuff up. It's not a policy stuff up. It's rank corruption. Right. And if you're going cold in winter this year because there's not enough heat, or there's not enough gas for the way they've got the electricity system set up on the East Coast here, where gas is the most important part of the firming system for the electricity, and we have a real problem either in the heat wave or in winter where we run out. That's because we're letting these private bastards dictate to us. And the government is serving them instead of the people of Australia. That's just flat out corruption. Heads should roll over this, right? Heads should roll. But what the two major parties have always done is just play off both sides against the other. And this is where my friends in the Greens, unfortunately, are pretty weak, because they let their ideology about gas being a fossil fuel get in the way because they don't want us to use it anyway. And they've criticised this, but they ultimately pull their punches. No, we're going to use gas, and you can't just sit back and let this cartel rip you off. They're criminals. Stop doing it.
Well, Robbie, we're close at the end time, but that's one more thing I wanted to touch on with you before we go. And I want to tell you about the map of the world, right? So this is one I saw the other day, which I thought was just brilliant. Okay. This is the Western map of the world, right? And the point I wanted to end on this is because, we're starting now to touch on some of the international issues. And the fact is, like it or not, the world is not shaped like this. And yet policy is being made as if it was. And for me, this is the other big issue for 2025, especially with Trump coming in and some of those other things. The fact is, this is not the shape of the world.
No. So keep that map up, Martin, because I have to make an observation about this map. It could soon be out of date because Greenland needs to go on there. Yes. We may come back to that. No, for those who don't know, this map was generated by people responding to the way the Western media sanctimoniously reserves all their ire for the countries of Russia and China and the global South and the third world and the Middle East, and they're the human rights abusers, they're the autocrats, they're the enemies of democracy, etc. And we, the lily white people, we are the moral. We occupy the moral high ground in the world, and in fact, we are the world. And so this when if you don't know it, there's a very important backstory, for instance, to the what Russia's the Russian war in Ukraine. It's not the simplistic Putin is a tyrant who just wants to gobble up the world story. Even if you, I don't have time to recap it, but look up Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, who's one of the most outspoken and most effective communicators on this. And even Donald Trump retweeted Jeffrey Sachs the other day on something he said. But the narrative is, the media would say, the world condemns Russia for invading Ukraine. And it's only those countries on that map. It's not the world at all. And the world is always condemning China for something or other, and it's only those countries on the map. That's barely a quarter of the world. The majority of the world is very much moving in a different direction. And by the way, that little thing above Australia there, that's Japan, in case you don't know. And conspicuously, there's a little dot that should be above Japan that this map, whoever did this map, is a bit incomplete, which is South Korea, which is actually part of this club. Because it's a country that's very much under American control. If South Korea ever goes to war, America controls its military, if you don't know. And if you've been paying attention, look what's happened in South Korea in the last few weeks. This is not democracy. In Eastern Europe, where there's a much more nuanced understanding of the politics related to Russia and Ukraine, etc., you've just had this bizarre situation in Romania where a politician who was opposed to NATO's war won the election, and so the powers that be in Europe just got the court to declare the election null and void. What is this thing called democracy? And now a French European commissioner has said that if there's two types of anti-NATO parties in Germany, one on the right, which is this thing called the AfD that Elon Musk seems to like, and one on the left, which I forget the name of her party, but she's a very eloquent woman who attacks this vociferously. And Thierry Breton, a former EU commissioner, has just gone on French TV and said, well, if those parties win the German election that's upcoming, we will nullify that as well. What is this thing called democracy? It is a joke. We've gone to war in the name of democracy in the 21st century. We have killed millions of people in the name of democracy as an extension of our moral authority in the world, and it's just not true. And you just have to look at how it's exercised in practice, and the whole thing's a bloody joke. So anyway, I'm glad you brought that up, because we now have, just to comment on a couple of things. We've got a situation where Donald Trump is a week from inauguration. Now, there's a lot that Donald Trump says that just leaves me bewildered, such as Greenland. But one thing he's been consistent about is actually ending this ridiculous war in Ukraine, and he knows that to end it, you've got to actually negotiate the very thing that the Americans and the Brits have stopped the Ukrainians doing for 2 years. And now, by the way, the Americans and the Brits are demanding that Ukraine lower its draft age from 26 to 18, because the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men killed in that war for nothing is not enough. All they needed to do, Martin, you remember this, you got me on this show on a short-term turnaround just before the invasion, right? And I was talking about there was an offer on the table that Russia had made and said, this is what we want to negotiate. And that included a peace treaty with NATO, a peace treaty with the United States, and just a demand that Ukraine always be neutral, right? That's all they had to agree to. And no, the Americans wouldn't even negotiate, wouldn't even give it the time of day. And now, literally hundreds of thousands of deaths later, the Americans and Brits are still saying to Ukraine, no, lower the draft age to 18 and send more people into the meat grinder to die. And Donald Trump has said he's going to end that. And what we've witnessed is since the American election, we've witnessed something unprecedented, because in his lame duck period, Joe Biden has done everything in his power to poison the well so that the mandate Donald Trump won his election on, he will find hard to deliver because of the things he's allowed to escalate in places like Ukraine, etc. The one that's more urgent for Australia, of course, is the question of China. This is where Donald Trump, or at least the people around Donald Trump, are nowhere near as sensible as on Ukraine. And some of them have this attitude, we need to actually end the war with Ukraine, make friends with Russia, so that we can have Russia join us in a big showdown against China. And it's just lunacy. And what they've done is they've built up Australia as a base. And when America does this, they think of these countries like Australia as unsinkable battleships where they can use this as a base to fight their war from. And if we allow that to happen, if we as Australians allow that to happen, we will be responsible for the destruction of our country just as much as these Ukrainian collaborators are with America responsible for the destruction of their country. This will be the end of our country because we will be destroyed. Russia and America will go to great lengths to avoid direct engagement, but in a proxy war where we're America's proxy, we'll be blown to smithereens. And unfortunately, we've got no one in the two major parties that's prepared to stand up to this agenda. This is one thing that the Citizens Party has almost been a lone voice on, us and Paul Keating of recent years. Good on Paul Keating for coming out on this question. But this is actually very, very serious. Now, I personally hope that when Donald Trump talks about China, his approach is more like his approach was to North Korea, which is all sound and fury, signifying nothing, because he wants to just, it's the art of the deal for him, right? Get a deal because he prefers to do business to war. And I do think he has a genuine aversion to war. But one sole man alone cannot be the president. And so a lot of these people that he's appointed to his cabinet are really problematic in this regard. And just to bring it home for people, Martin, I'm sorry I've gone on a bit. I just want to mention this. Since the 23rd of December, I've been infuriated because on the 23rd of December, our Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, approved the extradition of an Australian citizen named Dan Duggan to the United States on trumped-up charges relating to training that he gave to Chinese pilots back in 2012. And the whole thing is a complete stitch-up. And I don't have time to go through all the details. You can look at the stuff we've said about this on our website. And even the legality of the extradition is BS, because the principle of extradition is you only ever extradite someone if the crime that they're accused of meets the test of dual criminality, which means it has to be a crime in both countries. And what the Americans have accused this Dan Duggan of, who was a former US Navy Top Gun pilot, who in 2000 moved to Australia because he met an Australian girl, he married an Australian. He's now got 6 Australian kids and an Australian wife, and in 2012 he became a naturalized Australian. So he's one of us. He's as Australian as my grandfather was, who moved here in 1949 from England, right? And it's the reason I'm here. Or my father. My father was a baby. I forgot about him. He was a baby when he came. He was also born in England. Dan Duggan is as Australian as that. He has an Australian family, but he's been in prison here for 2 years while the Americans have been demanding this extradition. He's had to crowdsource the funding of his legal defense because his wife was going to sell her property on the south coast of New South Wales. It's worth $4.2 million to fund a legal defense. And then the day it was to go through, the Americans had it frozen in court as proceeds of crime. So even though they're up against the most powerful government in the history of the world, that government does not have doesn't want them fighting on a legal level playing field, wants them fighting with one hand tied behind their back. His little kids are now suffering. He's got little kids younger than 10. They're now suffering severe emotional problems because of this total disruption that's happened to their dad. He's never broken any Australian laws. He's a stand-up guy, but he's being scapegoated by these people who want to demonize all contact with China and to lay the foundation for a war with China. And that coward of an attorney general used the cover of Christmas to approve his extradition back to the United States. Now, the good news is yesterday his legal team was able to file an appeal because he could have been transported as early as the 1st of January. And if that had happened, then he would have been no time from the 23rd of December to the 1st of January to get an appeal up because all the courts were closed. But luckily he wasn't transported, so that they've now been able to file an appeal, and that will at least delay the process. But unlike in the case of Julian Assange, where there was a lot of effort to make sure he never got to the United States, that even the Australian government, turns out, was assisting behind the scenes to make sure that didn't happen, because they knew that once he got there, then it would be much harder to get him out. Our government has the power over this. It was the Attorney General's decision, but because it's the United States, they've signed off on it. And what this shows you, and this is a warning to all Australians, if the government coming after you is the United States, your government's not going to protect you. That's what this shows. And this is only happening because lunatics, if the American politicians in Congress, Martin, were in the Australian Parliament, everyone on this chat would hate them more than anyone in the Australian Parliament. American politics is the most dysfunctional. The politicians are completely corrupt. They're the scum of the earth. And we're allowing we're allowing our government to be completely obsequious to these people and their fantasy plans for a war just because they cannot imagine a world in which they have to share power with other great powers like China, like Russia, like India. No. We have to have a unipolar world where one country is on top at all costs, including even if that cost is a nuclear war. That's the world in which we live. And unless we, as a country that actually is in America's good graces, uses that relationship to start to say, hang on, no. The world is not with you. You're going to lose the support of Australia if you keep playing this kind of game, right? Then this is going to get worse and worse and worse. And the Duggan case is a case where this is destroying Australian people now, Australian families. And I want people to all be aware of that. The details are on our website. And if you've been moved by what I said, you can even help the family by donating. Look up Free Dan Duggan, Google Free Dan Duggan, and you'll see the ways you can donate to the family, etc. But this is something that is just completely unconscionable, and it's up to the Australian people to be aware of this and say no. And if you support that kind of thing, support the Citizens Party, including in the upcoming election.
Yeah, Robbie. Well, thank you very much. And that's the last point. Very disturbing, but very, very important. And I just, back to the map. This is not the map of the world, and yet this is the map that basically we're living in, because our politicians don't seem to have their own brain. They seem to be, basically just mind melded to the US. And when the US says jump, they jump, and when the US says, duck, then we duck. That is not the way to run a country. And so, for my mind, 2025 has got to be the year when we actually stand up for the interests of Australia and Australians rather than just the interests of the US, right? And realise that just because it's got a US sticker on the front doesn't necessarily mean it's always good. There are some, very important questions to be asked. The world is a complex and difficult place at the moment. Having politicians in the Australian Parliament who understand what's really going on and make better decisions for Australians is critical. And therefore, I think this year is going to be pretty important, which is why I spoke about the 25. If people want to find out more about the Citizens Party, where do they go?
All right. So we have our own YouTube channel, The Citizens Report. We have a great website resource, citizensparty.org.au. You can follow us on Twitter as well, and also I'm on Twitter at Robbie Barwick. But definitely look out for us more in this election. We're going to be running some pretty high-powered Senate slates for most of the states, and we'll look to have some significant House of Reps campaigns as well. All this is very expensive, of course, and a party like we're not Clive Palmer's party, so we've got a budget, etc., and do things strategically. But we should be much more noticeable in this election than in previous elections. So look out for us and get behind your local candidate, help spread the word, etc.
Thanks, Robbie. Well, I really appreciate your time tonight, and you're welcome to come back on any time, either another live or recorded show through particular issues. And we've worked really well together in recent years on some of these critical issues, I think to the benefit of Australians, and all power to elbow as 2025 runs out here, and big decisions ahead, and the decisions that people take at election time will be, I think, ever more important. Thank you very much. I can take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show. Take care. There you go, folks. Hope you found that informative and interesting. Some really, really important points from Robbie there. And I'll look forward to continuing that discussion with him through the year. Just in terms of next week, I'll be talking about the financial stress and modeling that I've been doing, and going into some postcode detail on that. So that'll be the show next week. So join me for that. And of course, there will be recorded shows the other days of the week. We continue to talk about property and finance each and every day, and so many things to talk about at the moment. So join me on those. In terms of dogs, I've got Meteor around my legs. So there's only Luna who's sitting in her basket, but she's been there all day and is now ready for lunch. So that'll be my next agenda. So thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. I hope you have a good Tuesday evening and a good week, and I look forward to seeing you on the live show next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.